Hey, Steve Casto here. Welcome to episode 2 of Connect the Dots. And before we get started, it's time for something completely different. Feast your eyes. All right, so here we go. Welcome to the party, Jay. Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah. So glad you're all fueled up and ready to go for the show. So here we go. Grab a few more chips, fuel up, and get ready to rock your brain. So last week we discussed how as a Christian we can provide sufficient evidence for God using only philosophy, science, and history. It was demonstrated that philosophy is the basis for science and that both are required to maintain a balance between the two disciplines. When science is used exclusively and philosophy is ignored, there are serious problems in determining origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And further, there are serious problems that philosophy must overcome when a God figure is removed as a basis for understanding origin, meaning, and destiny. We also covered Nietzsche's parable of a madman who predicted that the consequences and burden of filling the gaps for a godless universe would fall upon future generations. So here we go. Once again, let's rock your brain, folks. We're going to get deep in on some of this stuff, and if you have any questions or anything like that, please forward them through on the Facebook page or whatever page you happen to be on, Metal Matrix, wherever you happen to be watching. And I'll try to get to those questions in future episodes or live if I happen to be tuning in on some of the rebroadcasts. So anyway, without further ado, today we're going to continue with the philosophical problem of defining morality without God being in the picture. Can it even be done? Or does morality demand that there is a higher power behind it? And who or what defines good versus evil? For a starting point, let's begin with the following postulation. And I know that's a 10-cent word, but let's go ahead and define postulation. A postulation is a suggestion or assumption of the existence, fact, or truth of something as a basis for reasoning, discussion, or belief. So here's my postulation. If there is evil, there must also be good. If there is good and evil, then there has to be a moral law. And if there's a moral law, then there must be a moral lawgiver. And I get this argument without any jumping or leaping to conclusions. I get this argument up through the moral law aspect. But how do you make the jump from moral law to the need for a lawgiver? Can't moral law just exist on its own, similar to the way that mathematical laws don't need God to exist? For example, a mathematical truth demonstrates that 2 + 2 will always equal 4, and that's with or without God, doesn't matter. Logical truth also exists outside of a need for God. Here is a logical truth illustrated with correlative facts presented as truth statements. All men are mortal. Statement number 1. Socrates is a man. Truth statement number 2. Therefore, Socrates is mortal because all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. And those kind of logical laws stand up whether you have God in the picture or not. So we have evil that exists. Good exists. These are facts. And a sense of ingrained morality defines both. That is also a fact. Most non-believers, I'm going to have to turn that down. Uh-oh. I might have just lost something here. Sorry, folks. I'm playing with my phone, and I shouldn't be playing with my phone. But, oh, come on. Is everybody still there? Am I still there? So, anyway, while this tries to come back up, there we are. Sorry about that, folks. Technical difficulties on my end, just being all thumbs. But so how do you make the logical jump from moral law to the need for a moral lawgiver? It can stand on its own, or can it stand on its own? Because we do also have two truth things that can stand on their own, and that is mathematical truth and logical truth. So we have established that, to use some fancy philosophical terms, the former argument is of evil existing, good existing, and we can observe it through just everyday life. You know that there's good, you know that there's evil, and we have established that there is basically an ingrained sense of morality that we experience every day that defines that. That's called an ontological task. It's concerning the nature of reality. And when we try to figure out where that comes from, that's called an epistemological task. Don't ask me to spell it. It's concerning the nature of knowledge and how to acquire it. It could be the case that God made us in such a way that we are, in fact, able to apprehend laws or comprehend laws of mathematics, logic, and morality immediately, like upon birth, as soon as we get to a conscious age where we start thinking about those things that deeply. In fact, Scripture teaches that that's exactly what happens, specifically with regard to moral law. In Romans 2:14 through 15, the Apostle Paul writes, "Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things that are required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witnesses, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them." So the requirements of the law, from a Christian point of view, are established in our hearts, and our conscience testifies either for us or against us with regard to morality. That is why God judged the Gentile nations in the Old Testament for their evil behavior, even though they did not have the Bible. And they ought to have, it's simply because they ought to have known better. That is why God judges people who have never read the Bible and who may not care about it. They ought to know better also. So we should not let a skeptic get away with saying that since we can tell the difference between right and wrong without appealing to God, that we don't need God to ground morality. A good number of skeptics think pointing out that we can tell the difference between right and wrong all by ourselves is enough to disassociate morality from God, and it's not enough. How we learn about morality and what morality is grounded in are two very, very different questions. And again, it comes back to that ontological and epistemological argument there. One is just saying, yes, there is morality, it is reality. The other one is saying, where did that come from? But you can't just stop there, because you have to basically find the source, or else you're just left with, well, we'll get into that later. So philosophers proceed to point out that logical, mathematical, and moral laws are all necessary truths. When philosophers say that something exists necessarily, what they mean by that statement is, by being necessary, is that it has always existed, it will always exist, it is not possible for it not to exist. Now, I know that's a lot of stuff, but these are important things that we have to look into if we're going to be taking a look at the existence of God or the necessity for a God figure when you're talking about morality. Because this is what we left off with last week, is the necessity for morality to balance out science so that we can know where we came from and where we're going. So anyways, this is why we're going through a lot of this stuff. So we have to answer the question, the next question that has to be answered is, well, where did that, again, we're talking about the law of causality, what caused this moral law? And so we're going there. Philosophers proceed to point out that mathematical, logical, and moral laws are necessary truths. When philosophers say that something exists necessarily, they mean that it has always existed and always will exist, and it is not possible for it not to exist. Now, if the laws of logic and mathematics can exist without any need for a logical or mathematical lawgiver, the argument continues, why can't the laws of morality exist in the same way? Why do we need a lawgiver for the moral law, but not for logical or mathematical laws? The moral law exists necessarily or as a necessity, and it therefore doesn't need to be grounded in anything. That's what a skeptic would try to say. But there's some really solid reasons why that's not a good or a solid point to stand on. In response to this argument, we begin by noting a couple things. First, we're well beyond the boundaries that skeptics normally draw around the ultimate nature of reality. We are regularly told that all of reality can be fully explained by matter, energy, and the interactions that take place among or within material particles. With the argument we are now considering, the story shifts dramatically. In addition to the material particles and energy, we now have an entirely different realm of reality. And this is a reality that consists of abstract entities that exist necessarily and to which human beings are subject. That is no small shift. We now have one foot in the unseen world where God lives. We have to throw out materialism, to which most of the modern atheistic movement is intricately wedded. With the established defense that certain mathematical, logical, and moral laws are necessary, base elements of truth are irrefutable, the questioning shouldn't stop there. We continue with the epistemological argument about the nature of that knowledge and where it comes from. Now, the nature of mathematical and logical laws are based primarily in the natural realm. The truth of their validity can easily be observed, but morality is different. It's a standard of behavior that one must obey because it's a necessary truth and carries with it a sense that it exists from a position of authority over humanity. Let that sink in for a second. Yes, you can observe two apples sitting right next to each other and 1 + 1 = 2. All right, easily, irrefutable. And again, back to that, Socrates is a man. Man is mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. You know, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. You can observe that, and it will never be disproved or debunked or anything like that. So we have to go with looking at morality is basically stepping inside, and this is where I really want to go with this connecting the dots thing, is trying to make this big picture make sense of why we need God for there to be order, why we need there to be God why the God is necessary in order for morality to make even sense, or else, well, it'll be covered later. Why even bother with morality? Morality is a thing. There is good and evil, but let's just leave it alone, because you can't explain away why we must adhere to some type of morality, why certain aspects of what we do, certain aspects of our behavior, whether it's society or just on our own or in the presence of God, why those things are important to be looked at. So we're getting into the reason why we are where we are also. If we take a look back in history, now this is where some of the history stuff comes in, and I'll cover this in more depth later, but I just kind of want to give you, or to recap some of the purposes for this show, is that when we look at history, we wonder, how in the world did we get here? Where we call evil good and good evil. Why do people have no need for God? And why is there any necessity to even have such a creature when popular science has shown that there is no need and explains away a lot of the superstitions and mythologies that were embedded in Christianity over the ages? So when you begin to be disheartened with your belief system, you're going to start going off the rails. You're going to start looking for other reasons, because if everything that you have always based your life on is gone, then how do you fill the gaps? And that's what we covered last week with what Nietzsche said in the parable of man. Future generations will basically have to cover for the absence of God. Everything that was based around God is now gone, and we're going to have to figure that out. So when we get rid of our foundation for morality, then we're in a heap of trouble, because then you have to begin to define your own morality. And that's how we end up with relative morality these days. If it works for you, it works for you. If it doesn't work for the next guy, it doesn't work, it doesn't work for the next guy. Then you begin to have the aspect of, well, if the majority feels that this is moral and that's immoral, then you start going the route of just following the herd mentality of morality. And that's not healthy either, because like Ravi Zacharias said in the past, some neighbors, some cultures love their neighbors, and other cultures, neighbors eat their neighbors. Which one do you prefer? Which one fits your mode of morality best? So we end up with a heap of trouble trying to establish what is objective morality, what is the baseline for morality. So anyways, on with what we were getting into. Truth in the necessity of these standards assume that authority pre-exists the standard of morality. Authority wielded by what or whom? So we basically established that we have certain laws, math, logic, and those kind of things that we can easily observe. But yet morality steps into a realm where it's more ideas or truths that stir our soul, like, yeah, that's bad, or this is okay. So in the sense that morality is a law, and we have established that it is a necessity, it's always existed, it's always going to be there, and reality can't exist without it, then these standards assume that authority pre-exists the standard. What that means essentially is who gives the right, or who establishes the right, or who has the authority. I mean, for example, your neighbor could say such and such is wrong and then demand that you obey it. But then the governor or some person in authority comes along and says, this is wrong, you need to obey this. Well, what we have there is basically one person's an authority figure and another is not. But the way we experience authority is that across the board, everyone would agree that the slaughter of innocents is wrong. Murder is wrong. Stealing is wrong. All these different things are just kind of really, it just stirs up something that says, no, that's not right. That's not the right kind of behavior. People who stand up for the weaker, those are people to be admired. Those are good folk. People who feed the poor, those are good folk. We feel that internally, and what is the source of that is basically what we're getting. What is it that says this is an authority? This is what the truth is. This is what we need to abide by. So if we say, for example, that morality is a matter of human convention, then we must assume that we have the prior independent obligation to obey the directives of, let's just say, the community. If we say that what is right is determined by the majority, then we must suppose that we are obligated to follow the dictates of the majority, and that's without God. If we don't have God establishing the authority of right and wrong, then what are we left with? Can we individually make up those rules? I can't hold what I view as an authority over what you view, and vice versa. And so therefore you have to go with a majority, and everyone that agrees with that majority can fit in there. That's what this is talking about. And so here's how Mark Schroeder states this point in the publication called the Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy. So if this argument successfully shows that not all obligations can be explained by God's commands, then it looks like it must also show that not all obligations can be explained by self-interest, by hypothetical contracts, by what would maximize the good, by what is in accordance with rules no one could reasonably reject, or any other source. So basically what a skeptic is trying to do here is to uncouple the obligation from God and end up making the idea of obligation, and it ends up making the obligation, the censor, the idea of obligation even more mysterious. We can't go with the herd philosophy because the herd can get sidetracked and go here and there. With morality, we have to stay centered. We have to stay on point. What is good? What is evil? And is there an objective source for that? When you can't explain the source for that or why it has an authority, then you're just obeying this thing that exists because it exists. And it doesn't leave you any kind of resolution or foundation that you can base your life on. So The reason this has happened is because the attempt to show that obligations do not come from God, it rests on equivocation, and that's the use of ambiguous language to conceal the truth or avoid committing oneself to a certain ideal. We have to consider two statements. One, we are obligated to do what God commands. And number two, there exists a superseding prior obligation to obey whatever God or higher power, whatever higher power commands. In order to make the argument against explaining our moral obligations in terms of God's command work, the skeptic must assume that the second statement above is true. But the theist is not all committed to the second statement. All the theist needs is for this first statement to be true. There is no antecedent or no prior statement of fact or mysterious obligation that needs to be explained. That's from a theist's point of view, because we as Christians understand that we are obligated to do what God commands. But an atheist has to say that there is a prior or superseding or a prior obligation to obey whatever this higher power commands. And they have a hard time explaining what that higher power is, because you can't establish the authority that compels all of mankind to go with a certain rule set or moral standard set. The moral of the story thus far is that even the best of reasons routinely given for thinking that we do not need to appeal to God to ground morality do not succeed. If there's a moral law, there must be a moral law giver. Or else, where's the authority come from? Where's the basis for having to obey that or follow that command that says this is good and this is bad that we all have within us? In other words, the skeptic is left with no possible way of offering an explanation for the source of our moral obligations, because the majority isn't always right, and is still unwilling to connect objective morality to a higher pre-existing authority. Because the cultural majority changes between sects, communities, nations, and tribes, good and evil principles and practices may widely vary between them, and history reveals injustice and barbarity to be the norms in some cultures that in the present day we would consider to be quite evil. And you know, the standard example here is to refer to the Germans in World War II. You know, how was a cultural icon, the German citizenry, intelligent people, highly advanced people for the time, how in the world were they able to be swayed to commit these atrocities? I'm going to take one that is very popular with most anti-theists or skeptics or whatever you want to say. You take a look at the Inquisitions, and all these things were all the Inquisitions were to establish the truth, to get rid of heresy in the church, and they committed all sorts of atrocities to weed out any kind of thing that threw up itself against God. I mean, they had these incredibly imaginative inventions that tortured people, and this is in the name of God. And this is one of the reasons why people are really disillusioned with God, is because in an effort to establish truth as the authority, the firm hand of the church, we basically forced people, and it was abused. We forced people to admit to wrongdoing that they didn't do. We subjected entire families to torture. I mean, we look back on that now, and even as a person who doesn't believe in God, we'll look at the church and go, that was evil. And it was evil, but it was understood at the time, you know what? This is what we need to do. This is right. But they totally blew right by Scripture and the precepts of God in order to do these things. So anyway, the herd mentality is frequently wrong. We're not going to go with the herd mentality. It can't work. We have to have a superseding authority that pins us down to what is good and what is evil. So morality, and specifically moral obligation, is both agent relative I'll explain that in a second, and objective. When I say agent relative, what I mean is it can only arise in the case of persons. And objective is morality transcends human will. And if moral obligation is grounded in a person or persons and it is not dependent on human beings, then it must be grounded in a supernatural person, i.e. a God character. And I'll refer back to a Cambridge philosopher by the name of Elizabeth Anscombe in 1958. She argued that the concept of moral obligation in Western philosophy has its roots in Christianity, which conceives of ethics and especially moral obligation in terms of laws given by God. Now, with the abandonment of Christianity among many in Western philosophy, Anscombe counseled her fellow philosophers to get rid of the concept of obligation completely, since it is in the metaphysical foundation and is no longer possible for them to talk of an obligation that has thus become incoherent. When we consider what it means to say that we have moral obligations or duties, we quickly begin to see the validity of the point that Anscombe is making. And what the point that she's trying to say is that we have moral obligations. That is truth. We have, what was it? I read a quote. Care of our veterans. Well, moral how? Moral by whom? Where does this obligation come from? And you don't want to go down that road, because who obliges you to abide by that kind of morality? And since we have to address that when you're talking about morality, then what you end up with is you have to have a higher power. And so because you don't want, because a person who is basically trying to say, let's get rid of God, let's get rid of anything that ties us to that or him, then we have to basically say that, well, we don't know where this comes from. It just is. We just have this moral foundation and it doesn't come from anywhere. It's just in us all. And to me, that's an extremely weak argument for the moral law just being inherent. Because what establishes the authority by which we all have to abide? So the eminent moral theorist, John M. Stuart Mill, describes the concept of moral duty as follows. We do not call anything wrong unless we mean to imply that a person ought to be punished in some way or other for doing it. If not by law, then by the opinions of his fellow creatures. If not by opinion, by the reproaches of his own conscience. If it is a part of the notion of duty, it is a part of the notion of duty in every one of its forms that a person may rightfully be compelled to fulfill it. Duty is a thing by which may be extracted, duty is a thing which may be exacted from a person as one exacts a debt. Philosopher Joel Marx has argued that obligation does indeed require the existence of God, though he rejects morality instead of seeing it as further evidence of God. I had thought I was a secularist because I conceived of right and wrong as standing on their own 2 feet, without prop or crutch from God. We should do the right thing because it is the right thing to do, period. But this was a God too. It was the godless God of secular morality, which commanded without commander, whose ways were thus even more mysterious than the God I did not believe in, who at least had the intelligible motive of rewarding us for doing what he wanted. Pay really careful attention to that. This is a secularist speaking. This idea that we have duties, moral duties to perform, things that we have to do that are right, and condemn what is wrong. That is the godless God of secular morality. That's what he means by, these are commands that we have to obey, but there is no commander. They're just trying to whitewash all that to get rid of it completely for the sake of their own conscience. Similarly, Yale law professor Arthur Leff concluded in his powerful critique of morality without God with the following words. All I can say is this. It looks as if we are all we have. Given what we know about ourselves and each other, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Looking around the world, it appears that if all men are brothers, the ruling model is Cain and Abel. Neither reason, nor love, nor even terror seems to have worked to make us any good. And worse than that, there is no reason why anything should. Only if ethics were something unspeakable by us could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. As things now stand, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad, starving the poor is wicked, buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up to and died resisting Hitler, Stalin, Amin, and Pol Pot, and General Custer too, have earned salvation. Those who acquiesced deserve to be damned. There is in the world such a thing as evil. Altogether now? Says who? God help us. End of quote. So again, another secularist saying that if we don't have everything is pointing to there being a necessity for a God character, because if it's human based, it can be challenged. And if it's human based, again, we're going back to the herd mentality, or the idea that it is the majority that makes the rules and we abide by the rules. But even majorities can be proven to be unethical and immoral. All we need to do is take, like I said, look at the Inquisitions, look at the Nazis, look at the Stalin, look at the Marxist regimes, look at those who committed genocide. All those things were popular at the time and thought to be for good reason, but they were sorely out of the bounds of morality when looked at through the lens of history. The demands of morality frequently conflict with our self-interest in a way that suggests that they transcend mere individual or societal conventions. If we were solely responsible for assigning moral obligations to ourselves, why would we make them so difficult to fulfill? And why do we keep on trying to meet them when we have proven that we are incapable of doing so perfectly? Why not just adjust our obligations to match our practical abilities? Our very struggle in this area shows that we recognize the transcendent, otherworldly source for our moral obligations. Boom. The hound of heaven is ever on our trail. Consider the words of the following poem written by A.E. Housman. And how am I to face the odds? Oh, man's bedevilment and God of man's. Oh, sorry. Let me start that over. And how am I to face the odds of man's bedevilment and God's? I, a stranger and afraid in a world I never made. They will be master, right or wrong. Though both are foolish, both are strong. And since my soul, we cannot fly to Saturn nor to Mercury, keep we must, if we can, these foreign laws of God and man. So here the speaker acquiesces to the weight of moral obligation that he finds to be undeniable, even though it is foreign to his preferred mode of existence. Morality doesn't ask for our permission before placing its burdensome demands on us. How is such compulsion to be justified? Why should one yield to such demands? Christine Korsgaard's statement in this regard is worth considering. The question can become urgent, for the day will come for most of us when what morality commands, obliges, or recommends is hard, that we share in decisions with people whose intelligence or integrity don't inspire our confidence, that we assume grave responsibilities to which we feel inadequate, that we sacrifice our lives or voluntarily relinquish what makes them sweet. And then the question, why, will press, and rightly so. Why should I be moral? So that's what the anti-theist is basically left with. Why be moral? If you're trying so hard to get away from God that you're willing to explain away morality for the sake of not understanding its purpose or its source, that you really desperately don't want God. And why is that? I mean, why don't people want God these days? I mean, what is it that I covered this in some of my previous podcasts? What is it that compels people to get rid of God in their everyday life? Well, simply speaking, is that we all, by understanding, you know, like it was saying in where was that? It was one of the previous verses. Here it is. Romans 2:14 and 15. Indeed, when the Gentiles being non-Jewish people who did not have a copy of the Ten Commandments or the Deuteronomical law, indeed, when the Gentiles, people who weren't Jewish, who do not have the law, do by nature the things that are required by the law, they are a law for themselves. Even though they do not have a law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witnesses, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. So we have to take a look at the fact that when people can't explain why they're compelled to do what is good and right and feel as though they have a moral obligation to fulfill certain duties, where does that inclination come from when when all the arrows point to God? If you're so desperate to get away from him, you're willing to deny God. That brings up another issue, and that's matters of the heart. Man in and of himself is deceitfully wicked. Man sets himself up as basically an opponent of God in his own mind. Why? Because in man's own mind, we want to be right. We want to be established. We want to be secure in our own thoughts and in the way that we live our own life. We have to get around the ideas that we owe something to somebody else. We have a duty to somebody else or something else. Every man just wants to be free. But you know, we have to take a look at that New Testament scripture that talks about, you know, I'm a slave to Christ. My life is no longer my own. I was bought with a price, and that's why I serve him. So you have to figure out ways when you try to get rid of God in order to bolster your own belief system without him. You have to take into account what you can observe and what you can't observe and try to explain it in a way that gets rid of God. Morality is one thing that cannot be resisted when you're trying to take a look at where did it come from. That has to be the key point, is where do we get our morality from? It comes from a higher authority, something that precedes us. Because you're not going to obey your neighbor. You might obey the herd, but the herd can be wrong. It's not absolute. It's not objective. So therefore we have to come, because it's been proven wrong in the past. So we have to come back to the fact that there is a standard. This is right, this is wrong, and who established it? And all the arrows point to God. That's why this is such an important argument to factor in. And I'm sorry if you guys are commenting all over the place or have questions. I'm not able to see your questions or the feed right now. But at any rate, I'll try to address those if I get a break toward the end. And but I'm going to be moving on from here for right now. But I will try to get to those, I promise. And if I don't get to them right now, I'll at least answer them in text when I go through and peruse Facebook or wherever this is going to be airing later. So let's just put it this way. I find it absolutely mystifying that some would choose to deny the reality of morality rather than acknowledge the fact that morality indeed points us to God. That is their prerogative, although in the end they will find for themselves that they are without an excuse. This is the first verse that I brought up last week, Romans 1:20. It says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And thankfully, there are many others who have found their way to the cross after pondering the implications of an objective morality that is simply a part of the fabric of the universe." And so there we have it, folks. If you want to use philosophy to point to an existence of God, it can be done through going through the depths of a conversation about morality. Where does it come from and who dictates it? So that's the end of number 1 that I wanted to try to get through last week, but obviously there was a mouthful there. And I'm going to, right now I'm going to try to switch over to the chat here and see if I can find out what's going on over here. And try to see if I can answer any questions here. I want to open it up just for you guys to ask if there's any comments or questions or concerns or flaws in my argument. I want to basically. It can be done. Oh, I got feedback. All right, so here we are. All right, let's see. Let's see. I'm going to go back to the top. Here we go. I'm good home. Let's see. And let's see. Just by being morally good is not good enough without the Lord. Amen to that. Andrew Helms, Mike Trishelle, Jaimie. Hey guys. Roger, how you feeling, bro? Let's see. Roger, we're all with you, man. We're all praying for you, and I really hope to be able to meet you sometime or another. So let's see. Here we go. Charlie, good to see you. Amber, Andrew Helms. Let's see. All right. Doesn't look like we have a whole lot of questions here right now, but I do encourage you guys to pose your questions or comments or anything like that in the in you know, wherever you're watching this from, because I do want to help you guys to be able to evangelize in the future using some of these arguments. And some, granted, some of this stuff is kind of boring and dry or whatever, but I find it to be a couple of different things, really insightful and faith bolstering for those who already have a knowledge of God. But this just gives you further depth into understanding your faith and how to communicate it. And if you're struggling with certain aspects of, am I really following this faith thing? Is it really a pipe dream? You know, some of us come to those points sometimes. I know I did in my past, where I really wondered if God was even for real. And it takes, again, history to kind of reveal that. But in looking back, I really find that, yeah, God was totally there in the midst of it all. I remember a time back when I was in high school, something really, there was a big event in my life. And I was like, God, why didn't you deliver me from this? How come you couldn't prevent this situation from happening? How could I have been so stupid to allow myself to be dragged down into these, in this path? Where were you? Why were you even, why do I even call on you? What's the point? And that night was like the only time I'd ever, from where I lived in Pennsylvania at the time, seen the Northern Lights. And you know, and at that, and you know, I just can only imagine that that was God sitting there going, you know what, I'm here, I'm listening, stop being an idiot. And you know, so God was always there. But there are times in your faith where you have to ask questions. And it's not bad to ask questions, but you have to be humble in asking them. In other words, you can't go into it thinking that you know everything, or thinking that you're right and the Bible's wrong, or God's wrong, or something like that. We come into often our faith with preconceived ideas of what it's going to be all about. We hear the pie in the sky stories, the miraculous conversion stories, the amazing testimonies of those who've gone out and performed miracles, and we expect our life to be maybe a bed of roses or something like that. I know most of us don't really expect that in our faith. I think most of the people who are at least currently listening or have moved into a point where they understand that God wants to work with you through adversity, and that He is going to let His hand be felt when you feel abandoned, when you feel as though He's not there. That's when He's speaking to you the loudest. But we need to get past our pride and say, look, I'm willing to go through this. Be with me. And that's the most important thing that we can expect in our faith, is that God will always be with us. And He will take all things and work them together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. That's super important to realize, is that we're not going to be doing a bed of roses kind of a thing. We're going to be going through some troubles. I mean, look at Fox's Book of Martyrs. It goes through hundreds of years of people who were tortured and killed for their faith. Look at those who began church revolutions that were called into the Inquisition because they were preaching heresy and challenging the authority of the established church in Rome. We have to take a look at all those things and understand that the hand of God gave people the strength to be able to bear up under adversity. We have Thomas, who was basically like, no, I'm not buying this whole resurrection thing. I'm not buying that Jesus is alive, not until I can put my hands and fingers in his hands and put my fingers in the hole in his side. And guess what happened? Jesus came in. That's exactly what Thomas did. And then Thomas, years later, was he was recognized as the apostle that went into India and started preaching the gospel there. And he was basically killed with spears. This same guy that doubted. In fact, you can look at Peter. Peter, who was sitting there with the crowd when they were leading Jesus away, and they were questioning him. Hey, you were with them, weren't you? Yeah, you're that guy. I recognize you. And he's like, I don't know the guy. I have no idea. And then Jesus looked right at him. I mean, nailed him as the rooster was crowing. And then Peter remembered the prophecy that he would deny him before the rooster crowed however many times. And so we need to basically take a look at those kind of things that God isn't looking for perfect saints. He demands perfection, but he understands that we're not going to be perfectly saintly. He understands that we all have a ways to go before we can attain our glorified bodies and a perfected state of being where we're no longer at war with the flesh. He demands perfection, but doesn't expect us to be saints. So, because of our nature, I mean, we're all flawed. We're all on a journey from our point in time of when we became saved or before we even knew him, to finding him and being saved, and then getting to know him throughout the rest of our life, and probably even through all of eternity. I don't know if our minds will ever be able to conceive of how amazingly huge God is, if he is established before and after and during and is all at the same time through creation. That's a little bit over my head. I can't think that deep. But you know what? God is there to be discovered, and he wants to be explored, and he wants questions to be asked. And so if we're looking for more solid reasons other than Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so, go ahead and ask, because the evidence is out there. The evidence is out there to be found. And one of the ways to kind of start to wrap it up, one of these ways is through philosophy. If you take a look at morality, morality was one of the best ways that you can use to establish the need for at least a Godhead, or not necessarily a Godhead like the Trinity, but at least a divine being. So we're that far. There are other aspects that need to be attributed to the necessity for God that I'll start to get into next week. And we're going to be looking at, without God, where's our sense of meaning come from? Without God, where does our hope come from? I saw an interesting thing of what is hell? The absence of God. If God is love, there is no love there. But again, I don't want to get off on all that. But at the same time, there's also some debates about if God is everywhere, is he not also in hell? So anyways, we're going to leave it at that for that point. But you guys, I just want to tell you that I love you very much. If you have any questions, please do email or direct message me or whatever. You can come through through Facebook. You can go through this display, the YouTube. You can go through Metal Matrix. I encourage you guys to check out some of these other things. And I hope I've been able to rock your brain tonight and really make you kind of dig through some stuff and really think analytically. Now, granted, there's not a whole lot of heartfelt stuff in here, not a whole lot of emotions. This is just facts. This is A plus B equals C, and some things like that. And I appreciate David Plunkett saying, hey, it really is. It's not boring at all. And Mike too. I appreciate that. Thanks, guys. So I just encourage you guys to continue digging, continue asking questions, and and not be afraid of asking them, because everybody needs to ask. Everybody needs answers. Everybody wants to find out more reasons why they believe what they believe. And you can use those reasons, if you're willing to dig, you can use those reasons to help save others who have these same kind of questions. At least this will give you some basis to go on, some sense of foundation that can be reached. Because, I mean, frankly, the Bible is no longer considered an authority in our culture or even in this world by the masses. Amongst us believers and others, not necessarily Christians, but, the Bible's considered at least to be not necessarily an authoritative book, but a respected book in some of the other religions, where Christ is considered more of a prophet than God. And but a lot of people are not willing to look at the Bible in general as being an authority, because it's full of fairy tales. And if you're a Christian, you're just following after unicorns and superstition. And we are much more solid than that. And you can use elements that they're familiar with, philosophy, science, and history, to help answer their questions, because everybody's searching for a reason. Everybody's searching for a foundation, and we happen to be tapped into the source of it. So whether this stuff sunk in and is going to stay there permanently, and you can recite it off the top of your head, don't worry about what you're going to say when you're in front of authority figures, because God will always intervene and give you the words to say. Now, Mike Trishelle, he can always be one of the ones to give you the chapter and verse on that, but you can bank on it, that God will always give you the things to say and bring the things back to your mind that you've studied, that you've meditated on, that you've thought about. Even some things that he'll give you some divine knowledge or some supernatural knowledge sometimes. But you know what? This is what we're going to be connecting the dots with. The supernatural with the natural. How does the supernatural influence my natural life and the natural world? And these are the kind of things that I want to kind of lay out and make it a little bit more obvious. Yes, apologetics. That's what we're into, like it or not. So anyway, thank you, Nick, for commenting on that. So at any rate, you guys, again, I love you very much. I hope you're having a great week. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow for some more engaging and intriguing podcasts. And I just want to close this evening with a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you very much for instructing us and showing us how amazing you are, and for being there for us through thick and thin. Lord, I pray that you would gird us up with wisdom and with knowledge and a love for our fellow man, so that we can go out with confidence and boldness and take a stand for the kingdom that we are now citizens of, that we are trying to understand. Lord, I just pray that you would take the fog from our eyes and lift the veil, so that we can begin to understand you in a deeper way. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for giving us your son. Thank you for quickening our life, for making us alive in you and to you. Thank you for your son, Jesus. Lord, I just pray right now to be with Roger and help him with all the stuff that he's going through, with a lot of the people, like Sean and some of those others that are having some real difficult times right now. Lord, just watch over them and be with them. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, you guys, next week, we're going to be getting into some more really cool stuff. Why God is necessary for life to have meaning. So we're going to go into that next. I encourage you to tune in next week, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Again, we're still going through some technical changes and some upgrading of our broadcasting capabilities, and we're going to be ironing a lot of this stuff out. So without further ado, I'm going to be kind of wrapping stuff up and just turning it over to my director, Larry Fish, the amazing Larry Fish. So I love you guys. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Same bat time, same bat channel. And don't forget to continue to rock your brain as we connect the dots. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Awakening from a lingering slumber, the hazy mist dispersed from my eyes. Clearly around me, I am surrounded by enemies on every side. We give our losses, and if we must, we will die. In His service, our last command is our battle cry. Stand,
The weapons of warfare are mighty through God.
to the pulling down of
The
strongholds.
weapons of our warfare are mighty through God.
To the pulling down of
The
strongholds.
weapons of our warfare are mighty through God.
To the pulling down of
The
strongholds.
weapons of our warfare are mighty through God.
We give our losses, and if we must, we will die. In His service, our last command is our battle cry. Stand,
The weapons of our warfare are mighty through God.
to the pulling down of
The
strongholds.
weapons of our warfare are mighty through God.
To the pulling down of
The
strongholds.
weapons of our warfare are mighty through God.
To the pulling down of
The
strongholds.
weapons of our warfare are mighty through God. The peace of God when the battle's won. All my tears are gone by the Holy One. We must stand until the end. 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 We must stand until